People can basically ask any questions they want, use the tool in order to do that. And Zane here is going to be sending me, it looks like, questions over IM. And what I'll try to do is answer them in a little bit of some logical order, so that we're not moving around all over the place. But more questions, the better questions. Hopefully the better the next hour and 20 minutes will go. So with that, someone asked, is Microsoft Office live meeting under the DevDiv umbrella? The answer is no. We don't actually, my team or my division isn't actually responsible for live meetings, so I'm not sure if you're having a good experience with live meeting right now or a bad one, but either way, unfortunately, I don't have anything directly to do with it. A couple other questions people have asked. People have asked about the dynamic language runtime and Iron Ruby. For people that missed it, there was a bunch of traffic about that over the last 2 weeks. I will start off by saying I don't actually run the Iron Ruby team, and so I'm not speaking on behalf of the team. But in terms of kind of people were asking about the future of the DLR, the dynamic language runtime, that is something that now ships with .NET. It was built in as part of .NET 4, and so the dynamic language runtime is something that we definitely plan to enhance and improve going forward. I do think it's important as part of .NET. And you're going to see more and more investments in dynamic languages coming out of Visual Studio and .NET and DevDiv in general. So certainly from a dynamic language perspective, that is something that we're investing heavily in. A lot of the blog traffic has been around the level of full-time employee investment going on in some of the Iron, especially with Iron Ruby. I can't speak as authoritatively, again, because I'm not responsible for that team. In general, I'd say right now where we're at is we're in kind of the planning cycle for our next set of releases. And so nothing has been kind of set in stone for anything as of yet. But it is something that for all teams right now are kind of going through the planning cycle. So I don't know conclusively kind of what the plan is there. Certainly, one way, shape, or form, I do expect Iron Ruby to continue. I don't know. Some people have asked me, is there going to be IntelliSense inside VS? I don't know the level of improvement, but certainly dynamic languages are very important, something we're definitely investing in. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, as we finish up our planning process for the next product cycle, we'll have a better sense of exactly what features will be in the next release, and we can talk a little bit more authoritatively about what the plan is there. Other questions? Is Razor IntelliSense coming back and when? In terms of kind of one of the sort of new technologies that we're kind of coming out with on the website is this new view engine and language, it's not language, it's actually a view engine syntax we call Razor. It's originally the code name, but I think we're hoping to actually call it that when we ship as well, because it's kind of a cool name. Basically, I did a blog post on this. It's still on my blog, or I might have scrolled off in July, early July. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go back to my blog and find it. But it's a pretty cool language syntax, or parser syntax, that is a little bit more concise and, we think a little sharper, to use the pun, than the old angle bracket % nugget syntax that we've used historically within ASPX files. And we're basically planning to support Razor as a view template syntax for both ASP.NET MVC, starting with MVC 3, and you can actually use it now with the first public preview of MVC 3. And then we'll also support it with standalone pages. In terms of the IntelliSense support, the tooling support today with MVC 3 Preview 1 is basically just a text editor. You're going to see MVC 3 Preview 2, which is going to come out in a couple of weeks. We'll have full Visual Studio and Code IntelliSense support for both C# and VB. And so you are definitely going to see both colorization and code IntelliSense support showing up in the not-too-distant future for Razor. Other questions? People ask some data questions. Let me try to knock off a couple of those data questions. Someone asked a question about the EF4 code first model that I've been blogging about a little bit over the last couple of weeks. And the question was, is there any way to generate a model diagram in this mode? It's a good question. If you send me an email, I can find out for sure. I don't know off the top of my head if there's a way to persist the model. There probably is, but if you send me an email, I can find out for sure. Part of the goal of code first, of course, is that you don't explicitly need a model diagram or a model EDML file. Instead, you can basically use a code-only kind of approach to do your modeling. If your question was about a model diagram in a kind of a UML style sense, as opposed to an EDML style sense, the nice thing, again, also about the code first model is you're just creating standard plain old classes. So any class modeling tool that you have, including the one that's built into Visual Studio, will be able to support that and provide good modeling tool support for visualization. So if that's what you meant in terms of using the layer diagram, the sequence diagram support that's in Visual Studio 2010, that should just work with EF4 code first models. A couple other questions around EF versus link to SQL. Some people ask me, link to SQL, is it going away? Is it dead? Is the question some people often ask me. Link to SQL is definitely not dead, is always my answer. Link to SQL, continues to be supported in .NET 4. There were a number of, 20 or 30 features that we added to link to SQL as part of .NET 4. If you do a blog search on a name called Damien Gard, G-U-A-R-D, he's got a pretty good blog post. I've linked to it in the past, where he actually details a bunch of the improvements that came out with link to SQL in .NET 4. So it's definitely not dead, definitely not going away. The next release of .NET fully supports it, and as far as I know, there's never any plans to not support it. So it is a very safe option and a very good option. At the same time, we have been improving and investing in the Entity Framework 4, which is another ORM that uses Link that's built into .NET. We first shipped the Entity Framework in .NET 3.5 SP1. That version got, to be charitable, a lot of mixed feedback. The data team that I don't run actually took that feedback to heart, and I think the EF4 that ships as part of .NET 4 is pretty good. It's getting some pretty good feedback, including from people that were previously very vocal critics of EF in its first release. And so in general, I think EF4 is now a pretty good option to use. And there's both the version that uses the designer that ships in the box with .NET 4 and VS 2010, and then the new EF Code First option that's coming out later this year. So someone was asking, when would I use EF versus Link to SQL? With .NET 3.5, I personally preferred Link to SQL because I thought it was a little bit simpler model and a little bit cleaner for a number of scenarios. In the .NET 4 timeframe, I think EF4 is just as good as Link to SQL and actually has, in many ways, more features than Link to SQL now. So I think EF4 is also now a great option. If I was to start a brand new project, I would probably use EF4 personally. Either option is totally fine. But if I could use EF4 on .NET 4, I would probably go the EF route on a brand new project. But don't feel like you need to change any existing projects. You don't. And the other thing to keep in mind is because both Link to SQL and EF4 use Link as the query syntax, the nice thing is switching between them is easier than it's ever been before. So I think both are safe options. To the question of if I was to specifically personally start a new project today, I'd probably use EF4 personally. But again, both are fine options. Other questions people have asked. Let's see if there's any data ones, or else I'll move on. Too many more data ones. I want to ask, a lot of people in the blogosphere are livid about the introduction of the new dynamic keyword in C#. People are afraid this will turn C# into VB6, and then it'll be the end of C#. How can I put people's fears to rest? In general, I haven't seen as much I haven't seen as many people not like the dynamic keyword as it sounds like you're hearing from. In general, I'm a fan of the dynamic keyword, so if people don't know, C#4 introduced a new language feature, which is a keyword called dynamic. And so you can basically say, like, instead of, say product P or var P, you can now say dynamic P. And that basically indicates that you're going to use kind of a dynamic dispatch model to work with that variable reference. It's a pretty powerful feature in that it gives you the ability to do dynamic dispatch, which VB's historically supported, and which a lot of dynamic languages always support. So if you're using, say, for example, Python or Ruby, you're always doing dynamic dispatch. In terms of, I think it's a great feature actually for C#, because it's useful for a variety of scenarios where late binding makes a lot of sense. One of the most kind of immediately applicable ones has to do with like COM interrupt. So if you're ever working with like a late bound COM object, or say an Office automation object, or any of the built-in Windows COM automation objects, historically you had to do a lot of method overriding and passing in nulls, and it was a fairly non-friendly developer experience. And I think the dynamic keyword makes that a lot easier. There's a bunch of articles or posts recently about people using it for kind of more meta programming style scenarios involving dynamic. I think those are also some pretty interesting usages of it. So in general, I'd say to people, I think there's a lot of good reasons to have the dynamic keyword. If you don't like it, don't use it. Would be kind of my recommendation when people say, hey, I don't like that keyword. Both for advanced scenarios and for a tremendous number of interrupt scenarios, I think it's actually a really useful feature. C# is always going to be statically typed and type safe. That is kind of a characteristic of the language itself. So I wouldn't worry about the language morphing into something terrible. Anders is A, very good, and B, definitely has a strong sense of kind of why the language is good and what people like about it. But you are going to see, new features be added like dynamic, and I'm sure there'll be others in the future where I think it takes some of the best of other languages and other capabilities and blends it nicely as part of that static runtime. Other questions? One more data question, then I'll move on from data, which is, any news about Oracle support for Entity Framework? We don't like to work with third-party companies, and this is basically, how can I use the Entity Framework directly with an Oracle database? Oracle itself is actually working on an Oracle provider for Entity Framework, which I believe they're going to be shipping in the next couple of months. And so if at some point you do want to switch from the other third-party Oracle providers that are out there to one that is actually built by Oracle themselves, you should have that option in the next few months. I believe the way it works is you just change your provider connection string in your config file. I don't think you actually need to change any code when you do that. My understanding is the actual Oracle provider that Oracle's supporting will support the full EF. So not only querying and updating and standard stuff like that, but also some of the new EF4 code first features that we've shipped recently, like the ability to auto-create databases and so forth. That will also be fully supported by the Oracle provider, which my understanding right now isn't supported by some of the third parties. So basically, you're going to get full Oracle support in the future there. Other questions? Let's see. There's a couple of Silverlight questions. We're going to do a couple of Silverlight, and then we'll do WPF. Let me go back to web. Kelly will ask questions around, will the Silverlight runtime be as fast as the Flash runtime? Yeah, it's actually, Silverlight runtime today is actually significantly faster than the flash runtime for most operations. Certainly from a code computation perspective, it's faster. So yeah, performance is definitely something that we see. I just saw a link to some review that InfoWorld did about Silverlight versus Flash and Adobe Air that I guess just got published this week that I didn't actually even know about. And so I saw it through some Google alert. But they apparently really think we're faster too and are a much better runtime. So definitely go to infoworld.com and find that review. It's a pretty comprehensive review, and at least from the summary that I saw, it looks like we came out significantly ahead of the competition, which was great to see. Other questions around Silverlight that I see in this list here. How can we secure Silverlight pages was a question someone asked. Basically, you should be able to use standard kind of authorization capabilities you should be able to use standard authorization techniques with ASP.NET or any other server-side approach with Silverlight. So basically, you can lock down both the ZAP file, which is the code that runs with Silverlight. It's kind of the binary file that gets downloaded. You can you can authorize any of the web services that your Silverlight client calls. Again, using standard kind of ASP.NET authorization techniques, and that should all just work just fine. In general, also, Silverlight uses the same networking stack as Ajax or any client-side JavaScript does on the browser. So if you set a forms auth cookie, for example, in ASP.NET, your Silverlight calls will go ahead and pass on that cookie every time they make a call back to the same server. So it should be generally fairly easy to integrate there. A couple other questions around a couple WPF questions. Why does Lightswitch not output WPF? Does Microsoft not have confidence in WPF, or is it because it's too difficult? A little bit there. In terms of why Lightswitch outputs Silverlight, mostly because for the audience that it was going after, a lot of people really wanted kind of web-deployed apps, and in general, we think Silverlight provides a pretty good mechanism for doing kind of web-deployed inside the browser-based apps, as well as obviously outside the browser-based apps. So for those types of apps, that's the main reason we targeted Silverlight, is we thought that made more sense for that scenario. In terms of confidence in WPF, I'd say we have a ton of confidence in WPF. We just rebuilt Visual Studio 2010 in WPF, and Lightswitch itself is actually built using WPF. So that's definitely not a statement that we don't think WPF has an important role. We wouldn't have built our own products on it if we didn't think it had a good role. But anyway, that's specifically along those lines. It looks like there's a bunch of Lightswitch questions. Let me just quickly go down this list and try to make sure I get all of them here. I don't run the Lightswitch team, so a few people have asked me for specifics about the Lightswitch plan. I can tell you what I know, but I just want to make it clear I don't speak for the Lightswitch team themselves. In terms of kind of what we're trying to do with Lightswitch, for people who don't know, it's a new version of Visual Studio that's coming out, and then all the Lightswitch features will be in the higher-end versions of Visual Studio, so things like Professional. It will also get these capabilities. It's basically targeted at building kind of data-driven applications. A lot of it's kind of going after, I'd say, the same audience that Access Apps historically went after, where it kind of forms over data scenarios for data entry, which are a little bit more interactive than the traditional web-based data entry forms, and use things like charting and things like that. Lightswitch itself, generates Silverlight apps. It's designed so that it's less for like a procedural coding kind of model. Basically allows you to kind of design your data, create design models that are EF 4 base models classes on top of those data, and then basically kind of associate and lay out forms that bind to those models. And then it handles using WCF RIA services on the wire, updating, retrieving that data for you. And it's, I guess part of the goal is to go after kind of an audience that today has to use access to do that type of thing because they're not typically writing procedural code or capable of writing procedural code, and it's kind of designed for kind of a narrow sweet spot of type of application. One of the things, there's been a lot of people have asked, like, hey, is this going to create bad applications? Is this going to create unmaintainable applications? Part of the goal with LightSwitch is it is generating a Silverlight app, and it's extensible so that you can basically build your own custom user controls using the same standard Silverlight designer you use today, and use standard Silverlight data binding techniques like you do today. So it is possible to basically extend LightSwitch applications, plug in custom code, and that custom code you do plug in does end up being the same code that you'd write if you were building a vanilla WCF RIA services app using Silverlight in Visual Studio today. But the goal is to try to provide a little bit more of kind of guardrails so that people that aren't professional developers can actually be successful, not generate crap, and not have to necessarily wire up web services themselves, but actually instead just sort of for kind of the 80% sweet spot, get it working well. And then again, a professional developer can open the same project up in Visual Studio and can basically write custom Silverlight code to extend it even further. So anyway, that's kind of the goal behind it. In terms of, a couple of people asked sort of, what's the next iteration of the roadmap? I don't have actually, unfortunately, the specific iteration roadmap in place because, again, I don't run that team. I do know that they're starting to talk about it publicly, and that there's the beta coming up shortly. And to some extent, the iteration roadmap will depend a little bit on the feedback people have once they start playing with the beta and kind of iterate on top of that going forward. In terms of how do I feel Visual Studio LightSwitch fits into the development community, in terms of, I think, it's kind of providing I kind of view as a way to basically build Silverlight data applications. And, I think where it hopefully grows the community a little bit is, there's a class of developers that, today Visual Studio is too much. And hopefully what LightSwitch does is it provides a way that they can build those types of apps. And again, do it in such a way that the resulting app is not kind of like Access where it's kind of off on its own, but instead it is actually hopefully an application that a professional developer could then go in and open and customize and extend using the standard techniques that they're already familiar with today using Silverlight, .NET, and WCF RIA services. So yeah, that's a little bit about LightSwitch. Other questions here. People asked about what's the main features in .NET 5 and the pillars. Well, we just shipped .NET 4. We were three or 4 months ago. So we're definitely planning .NET 5 right now. It's a little early in terms of talking specifically about the feature set. In general, I'd say, as we think about .NET and we think about Visual Studio kind of evolution, we often think about our roadmaps kind of in terms of both evolution and revolution. And the evolution is sort of how do we keep putting out kind of nice, at a fairly rapid, agile pace, nice incremental improvements to the existing stuff. So, for example, I'd say, things that we're shipping this summer around, ASP.NET MVC 3 previews, EF Code first previews, the new Razor view engine syntax for MVC, kind of all examples, I'd say, of nice incremental improvements that, don't replace kind of your existing knowledge in a big way, but hopefully make your existing project work better. some of the power tool improvements, power tool enhancements. And, in general, we kind of view there's a lot of value in doing that, in that by having kind of continual iterative improvements, hopefully developers don't feel like, oh my God, the world's changing on me every 6 months and I have to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. And instead, hopefully, you feel like, wow, there's a lot of good stuff coming out where my life just gets better. IS Express, SQL, Compact Edition, those would be other examples of, it doesn't change how you build apps, but it doesn't change the code you write, but hopefully it just removes some friction and makes building apps even simpler and easier. At the same time, then we will do major releases of .NET where we'll kind of do more revolutionary things. Silverlight might be an example, or WPF might be an example. The first ASP.NET MVC, in some ways, was an example of kind of a big new thing. And generally, I'd say what we try to do is kind of have some nice combination of that, so that every couple of years we will do kind of the big revolutionary things, and then you'll also see us month in and month out, hopefully doing lots of evolutionary things that make life better. And so, just philosophically, that's kind of how we think about it. We've got both a bunch of nice evolutionary things you'll see come out in the next 6 to 8 months. And then, we've got a couple of more revolutionary things cooking as well that'll be kind of more of the couple years out kind of model. The other questions. A couple questions about jQuery. Someone asked a question about JavaScript IntelliSense for VS and around jQuery. We actually do have jQuery IntelliSense supported in VS 2010, which I'm not sure the person asking it realized. So yeah, if you actually create a new ASP.NET Web Forms or MVC project with VS 2010, and then add a reference to both those project types actually have jQuery built in. And if you add a reference to those to your page, you will find you get pretty rich jQuery IntelliSense against them, including things like argument signatures, help around the methods, and so forth. So in general, you should see there's a lot of pretty rich JavaScript IntelliSense improvements that came out with VS 2010. And you're going to see much more investment in JavaScript going forward with Visual Studio in .NET. So you'll see even richer jQuery support in the future. A few people have asked, what are some of the forthcoming jQuery contributions that Microsoft plans on making? You should probably see a couple blog posts from me over the next really 3 to 4 weeks that'll talk a little bit more about that. We've made a couple of pretty big jQuery improvements, contributions in the last 4 or 5 months since we announced that we were actually contributing code to jQuery. Right now, there's kind of 3 big ones that we've been focusing on to begin with. One is templating syntax that allows you to do kind of data binding and templating support on the client side with jQuery. And as part of that, there's a data linking a library that we're shipping that lets you do kind of two-way data binding against live JavaScript objects with that. And then also, we've been contributing a jQuery globalization plugin that makes it a lot easier to globalize applications built with jQuery. So things like date formats, number formats, time formats, etc. Both those things we've actually already contributed under an open source license. And I think you'll see a couple of announcements in the next couple of weeks in terms of their status with the jQuery Foundation. In general, I think we're pretty excited by the progress. jQuery Foundation is excited by the progress. We're also going to be helping to sponsor, in addition to contributing code ourselves, we're also helping to sponsor some jQuery developers so that they can actually spend more time doing, these are non-Microsoft employees, but doing more time actually writing jQuery extensions that both .NET developers can take advantage of, but also non.NET developers will be able to take advantage of as well. So expect to see some more announcements about that in the next couple of weeks. Other questions people have asked. What about jQuery UI support, someone asked? That is something that we're looking at more in terms of jQuery UI. And we don't have, I don't have anything I announced today, but I think you will you'll probably see some richer jQuery UI support in the future, hopefully, that I'll be blogging about in the not too distant future. So I'll let you surmise what that means. Let's see. Kind of a futures question. We've found many in the industry believe LINQ was a game changer. We now use LINQ in every layer of our application for many different purposes. What .NET feature do you think will have a similar impact going forward? Good question. I'd say I can't necessarily share all the details. We're still under development for some of those features that we think are game changers. Kind of going back to earlier when I was kind of mentioning both evolutionary and revolutionary development. I think there's a couple of pretty good features we're working on right now that I think both have the potential to be both evolutionary and revolutionary. In the way that LINQ was a bit revolutionary. I think there's a bunch of language features that Anders is working on right now that I'm really excited about. I don't want to steal his thunder, so I can't mention them directly, but they're pretty darn cool. There's a bunch of great ASP.NET and .NET library features in general. I think in the data space, I actually think the EF code first stuff that's coming out has the potential to be kind of a game changer in terms of kind of productivity around data access. I'm really enthused about that. I think the Razor syntax that ASP.NET and MVC is going to be supporting, once you start playing with it, you kind of go like, how does this work? I can't believe it's this easy and fluid. I think that has the potential to be a game changer in the web space. There's a bunch of VS work that we're doing that I think, from a tooling perspective, also has a great opportunity to be kind of a game changer. A bunch of Visual Studio work going forward that I think will be really big. So, likewise, there's a bunch of Silverlight features, WPF features that my team's working on that I'm pretty excited on the client side will be a game changer. So, in general, I think there's a lot of things, features and capabilities. I think you're also hopefully going to see in the next not too distant future, us talk a little bit more in terms of kind of both the features that we provide at Microsoft and ship, both as part of .NET and Visual Studio, but also how we can, support and foster kind of a really vibrant open source ecosystem around our products as well. And there's some exciting stuff that I think we'll be doing there that I think the community will really like and respond to. And so, those are also things that I'll be talking more about. And so keep an eye on my blog. I'll talk about many more of those things in the next month or so ahead. Let's see. A couple of questions. Unfortunately, features that we won't have, but I'll answer them anyway, which is SQL Compact Edition. What's the story around text searching, so free text search, as well as around free text search? Unfortunately, I don't think free text search is supported. If you send me mail, I can find out the roadmap to that for sure. But unfortunately, I don't think SQL Compact Edition is supported in terms of free text search. But send me mail, I can find out for sure. Someone else asked a question I do unfortunately know the answer to, which is around the spatial data types in SQL Compact Edition and around EF. When will EF support SQL spatial data types? That's coming in the future. That's definitely part of the plan in terms of coming in the future. Unfortunately, it's not going to be part of EF4 code first, so it's unfortunately going to be in a later release. But it is definitely something I know the SQL team is definitely focused on and is going to be working pretty hard on that. A couple other questions, do some web questions. Last question. If I was starting enterprise level, one second, you can stop typing Zane for a second because I can't, it's scrolling so fast I can't read it. If I was starting an enterprise level web application today and the client would prefer to use VS 2010 with .NET 4, would you suggest ASP.NET MVC 2 or ASP.NET 4 web forms? That's a good question. In general, depends on your background. So, whether you go MVC or web forms, the first thing I always tell people is they're both fine options. They're both fully supported going forward. Don't think there's some reason you need to use one versus the other. And the reason we have to is mostly because, we think there's an audience for two of them. If you're starting out in from the enterprise application perspective, one thing to ask yourself is, to what extent do you want to embrace unit testing, and to what extent do you want the application you built on a very patterns-based approach? For some projects in the enterprise, the answer is yes, definitively, in which case I think ASP.NET MVC is probably the easier answer there, in the sense of if you want something that really embraces unit testing and test-driven development and strong patterns, MVC is a pretty good option for that. And that ends up being a bit of an easier answer. If the answer is, well, it's more of a department-level app, or, I want to have some level unit testing, but I don't feel like I need to have all my pages unit tested. Instead, I just unit test my domain logic. Web forms is a fine answer there as well. And, web forms gives you a couple of big benefits around reusable controls. And so if you have a library of existing controls, or a library of controls for the specific app type that you're building, the productivity that you can get with web forms is quite significant. So, web forms in that sense is an easier answer. So, the way you wrote the question sounded like it was very enterprise with some testing involved. And so, based on that bit of, admittedly small bit of data that I have about the project, it might make sense to go with MVC. But again, if testing was not as important, and again, if it was a type of app where you think the productivity for control would give you an edge, then, web forms is a good answer as well. Both are fully supported. You should feel comfortable with whichever bet you make. And, the other thing we always point out is you can always have an app that uses both. So it's not a one-way decision that you need to make up front. I think the most important thing is, design the architecture so that your data and your business logic is separated from your UI no matter what, whether you're doing web forms or MVC. And that will always give you the most options going forward. And it also means that hopefully your architecture going forward will be well maintainable for the future. A couple other ASP.NET questions here. There's one here. My MVC2 book utilizes Nerd Dinner updates to Nerd Dinner 2 with info on how WCF, OpenID, Social ID. Okay, yeah. So I wrote an ASP.NET MVC book, this Nerd Dinner tutorial. You can find it on the web. It's Nerd Dinner tutorial. It's one of the links there. I actually wasn't involved in the MVC2 book. I was involved in MVC2, but not actually in the book. But John Galloway updated the Nerd Dinner tutorial. And so if you buy the ROC's professional ASP.NET MVC2 book, there is actually a new MVC2 tutorial, Nerd Dinner tutorial that's been updated. I think it uses actually EF4 instead of link to SQL, and it shows off using the new MVC2 features. The question here was, what about features like OpenID, social, WCF, etc.? I think if you go to the CodeFlex project for the Nerd Dinner app, which I think is like nerddinner.codeflex.com, I believe it actually does have more features than the actual tutorial inside the book has, including, I think, an OpenID option and some more social networking features. So if you go check out and download that sample off the web, it's free, from CodeFlex, I believe you can find some OpenID support, and I think it also has some mobile support, including support for things like iPhone, iPads integrated as well, and shows actually how to do that. Let's see, other questions here. Someone asked a question about the roadmap for ASP.NET MVC, and asked about what's the roadmap, and the question here looks like, how does it compare with sounds like Rails? In terms of kind of the roadmap, I blog a little bit about the beginning of the roadmap for ASP.NET MVC 3, and the first preview of that is available now for download, and the final release of that will come in the next couple months, kind of the 6-month time frame. I think you'll find MVC3 is a pretty good update. It's got a lot of improvements around the UI layer, the new racer syntax, has a lot of new HTML5 and unobtrusive JavaScript support being added to it. It has a lot of new jQuery UI, jQuery validation and other support there being added to it. And so you'll see jQuery and JavaScript support in general just enhanced dramatically. You're going to see with it much richer dependency injection support and testing support. So if you want to test without requiring a database and enable a very clean either test-driven development environment or just unit testing environment, MVC3 goes a lot further in that regard. And you're going to see with things like EF code first, a very clean data access model that I think is really clean. So in general, I'm feeling pretty bullish on MVC3. And I feel pretty good that with MVC3, I think we'll have the best web MVC framework out there, which is a bold statement, but yeah, I'm feeling pretty good in terms of where that's at. So that'll be coming out. You'll see more previews in the months ahead, and the final release of that is not too distant in the future. Let me see if there's any other web, and then I'll move on to mobile. There's a question about MVC3 auto mapper support and around some new controls. We're not, so there's a cool project that Jimmy Bogard runs called the Auto Mapper Project. So the question is, hey, are we gonna implement auto mapper-like functionality directly into MVC3? In general, you know, kind of our philosophy going forward is try to be kind of more embracive of open source. You've seen us do this a little bit with jQuery already. You know, in general, if there's a good open source library project out there, we kind of want to avoid just duplicating it. If we're just duplicating it for duplicating's sake, instead what we want to try to do is embrace it and make it easy for people to use. So you're going to see, again, more details about that probably in the next couple of weeks and about some of the specific initiatives that we're doing to try to do that. So we don't, specifically with AutoMapper, we don't have plans to kind of duplicate AutoMapper. Instead, what we want to do is make it super easy to use AutoMapper within ASP.NET MVC3 and MVC2 for that matter. But you know, so we kind of talk pretty regularly with Jimmy Bogard, who runs the AutoMapper project, and you know, ask for design feedback and you know, suggestions that he'd like us to do that would make AutoMapper work even better in the MVC3 context. And that's kind of a little bit more of the approach we're going to take, which is how do we build a better platform for him to actually build on top of. In terms of and then the other question you had asked was about, what about more controls? In general, you are going to see a few more UI helpers with MVC3. You're going to see us probably use, for example, jQuery validation for all the validation support, which is an open library. And you're going to see us probably integrate, you know, you probably see some richer jQuery UI integration as well into MVC3. So in general, we're going to focus with MVC a little bit less on server controls or server functionality, and instead look at how we can take advantage of JavaScript and jQuery and JavaScript frameworks like jQuery on the client to implement controls. So, for example, you asked about calendar, date picker, things like that. We'll probably look more at, okay, how do we kind of output unobtrusive JavaScript? So if you don't have JavaScript, there's still a fallback. But then take advantage of JavaScript to implement some of those kind of UI, widget, or control functionality on the client side. The other web questions, and then I'll skip ahead. I'm just scanning here to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, here's a question here. Is it possible to have multiple webpack config files and cool deployment features in a website as in a web application project? So I started blogging. I'll be continuing this series shortly about some of the new web deployment features that came in VS 2010. And the question here, I think, is it possible to use those deployment features in both web application projects as well as website projects. So if you remember, website projects are the project model that VS supports for ASP.NET, where you don't have a project file. Unfortunately, because of time, some of our new web deployment features in VS 2010 only work with projects that have project files. So they work with web application projects, both web forms and MVC, but they don't work with website projects in the VS 2010 release. It's something we're going to be looking at in the future, but unfortunately, out of the box right now, you do need to be a web application project in order to do things like the config file transform capability. Other two questions he asked were, Slava asked was, can you tell me about your daily schedule? How do you manage to be productive? And how many hours do you sleep at night? In general, kind of my day, some days I feel more productive than others. In terms of kind of my daily schedule usually starts at 8 or 9, and I don't know, goes to 5 or 6 at work. I usually spend most of my day at meetings, whether they're design reviews or we call one-on-ones, where I'm just meeting with someone individually. I spend a lot of my time kind of in reviews, doing design reviews of code, strategy reviews in terms of what we're building. I spend a lot of time on people management. I manage a lot of people. So, you know, career development stuff with people, making sure that kind of teams are set up for success. So hiring the right people, making sure people are kind of in the right roles on teams and operating kind of at full capacity. So, you know, that's kind of where I spend a lot of my time on a day-to-day basis. And then I do most of my blogging actually at night. So typically when I do my blog posts, you usually notice my blog post times around somewhere between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. That's usually because that's when I actually have time to actually write them. So in terms of how many hours of sleep a night do I get, less than I'd like. I usually probably get 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. So I do have a fan, so I actually spend most of my time at night with them, and then when they go to bed, that's usually when I start blogging. So, yeah, I wish I had a little bit more sleep. I've been jet lagged the last 3 days. I just came back from Europe, so I'm experiencing waking up at 5 a.m., which is actually kind of a productive time of the day, but it does mean that by 11 p.m. I'm starting to really drag because it's, I don't even know what time it is, my body clock time. But anyway, that's roughly what my schedule looks like. A couple other web questions. What about IS Express? When is that being released? You can get, excuse me, IS Express today by downloading the Web Matrix tool, and it's integrated inside Web Matrix. IS Express itself will ship later this year, and we're building in full Visual Studio support for it. So you'll be able to manage it. You know, you'll be able to take any ASP.NET project, pull up the project properties. This is true for both website and web application projects, and say, hey, I want to use IS Express instead of IIS or the built-in Cassini web server that you use by default. And we're actually adding in the VS support, so you can do things like configure SSL certs and a whole bunch of other features. So yeah, you'll see much richer IS Express support coming in the future. And the final release of that will be in the next couple months. Someone asked a question about Web Matrix, or two people asked questions. Someone said, like, I observed that the Web Matrix post has been removed from Scott's blog. Just pulling up my blog right now. Shouldn't have been. I think what you might be referring to is it's no longer on the homepage of my blog. There's nothing sinister about that. Basically, my homepage only shows the last 10 posts, and I think if you click next on the post thing, you'll see it show up. So definitely am not taking down any Web Matrix posts. It's just that there's now that was more than 10 posts ago, which is probably why it wasn't showing up. So in terms of kind of Web Matrix in general, like why are we doing Web Matrix? People have asked that, and people ask about what we think the reception of Web Matrix is. You know, in general, we're doing Web Matrix because we think there's an audience for whom ASP.NET and Visual Studio today is either a little overwhelming for someone trying to learn it from scratch, or who kind of prefer kind of a more kind of a scripting model, if you will, where I want to be able to very quickly build a site, and I want to be able to, for the most part, a static HTML site, but I want to add a tiny bit of dynamic functionality. And creating a project, whether it's a web forms or an MVC project, and having a project file and writing classes and code behinds or object relational mappers, those people might eventually do that, but that's a little overwhelming for them to start off with, or it's a little overkill for the specific scenario that they're going after. And a lot of those people today end up using PHP primarily as kind of the technology they use. And kind of our goal with WebMatrix as a tool was to basically provide kind of a pretty lightweight tool that for both people learning programming and then also professionals that are looking for a fairly lightweight solution can basically have a pretty good story for doing that. In terms of again, kind of the audience and what we've kind of gone after with it, part of what makes we think WebMatrix kind of a nice tool for people is it's less than 10 megs to download, it's fast to install. It includes IS Express and SQL Compact Edition, and it includes the Razor syntax. We also support in ASP.NET MVC, but it supports it in kind of the context of just within an inline page. And in general, I think if you're trying to explain to someone new how to program, it provides a pretty sweet environment for doing that. And we're certainly finding for the audience we're going after, it's being received incredibly well. We've been showing it to PHP user groups, we've shown it to schools and academic environments, and shown it to just a lot of web developers, and including a lot of .NET developers that are like, hey, I just want to put up a blog. I don't want to write code. I'm just trying to, how do I configure WordPress, or how do I configure .blog or Blog Engine or some of the other .NET-based blog tools. And WebMatrix provides a nice way you can both start from scratch on a project, but also you can say, download a .NET or PHP open source app, tweak it, publish it, and you're good to go. In terms of kind of how the professional audience kind of receives it, I think a lot of people, have wondered, like, hey, what is this thing? Is this for me? Do I need to learn it? In general, one of the things we tried to do when we announced it for the first time is just to be clear, like, hey, this is going after a slightly different audience. And what I tried to say in my blog post was actually, if you're reading my blog, you're probably not the audience we're going after. And some people kind of freak out and think, well, wait, why shouldn't it be for me? The route is again, we're going after kind of a slightly different audience. And the thing I always try to, I kind of use in the posts I wrote was to say, use the analogy when you first learn programming. I remember I took my first college programming course. The whole semester we kind of worked up, and we started off with like, here's a variable, and here's how to assign variables and loops and stuff. And the final project I think was, how to build an app that I think parsed some Shakespeare play and counted up the number of unique words in it. The embarrassing thing is I can do my entire semester project now in one line of a link code. Linked objects let you actually do that and do the sorting and the diagnostics literally in one line of code. But the concept count to do that one line of code is something that I know now, but at the beginning of my college course, I didn't know. Trying to explain lambdas and explain objects and object-oriented programming and sequences and collections and generics, and I think we often take for granted all those things. And, I think WebMatrix does play a really important role in terms of helping onboard people and, increase the number of developers out there. I don't think people should view it as, oh my God, my job's going to go away because suddenly someone who's an idiot is going to be able to do it. The reality is, I think if you're a professional developer, and I put myself in that category, and I think everyone on this call probably is certainly in that category as well. The value we provide is much higher than simply being able to copy paste some HTML and call it done. There's if you're building real applications, you're going to need the professional skill that you have, and this tool really isn't aimed at that audience that most people are using .NET Visual Studio for today. The other thing I'd say, some people have asked, hey, does this mean that we're not, investing in professional or higher-end features? I think the Web Matrix project's like 4 guys, so that's the level of investment we're making. We do think it's important, but to be clear, it's a very small percentage of our total investment. And if you look at just the last couple of weeks of some of the products that we've shipped, we shipped VS 2010 and .NET 4 about 3 months ago. That was a very major, entirely professional developer-based product. And even with things like ASP.NET MVC3 and EF Code First, and using SQL CE for POCO-based objects that can automatically be created in a DDD-like fashion, and using IS Express for professionals and integrating that inside Visual Studio and making SSL integration easier to test, and so on and so forth. Just the level of investment in the web space alone on professional high-end features, you're going to see, that's always going to be 95% of where we're investing our resources on, or higher. And you're going to see even more professional investment in the months ahead. So definitely don't worry that we're somehow shifting to the low end. I do think Web Matrix is important, but our emphasis with .NET and DS is always going to be primarily, by primarily I mean 99%, focused on the professional and the higher-end enterprise space. So, other questions around, will .NET 4 be included in the Windows OS Service Pack or stay as an optional component for people to download? Interference there. Okay. .NET 4 is now available on Windows Update as what's called an important update, which means that more and more people each day get prompted to install it. At some point, we actually dial how many people install it on a per-day basis. We kind of slowly turn the dial up so we don't kill the internet when we release it. You're going to basically see everyone that has Windows by default, if you're on Windows 7 or Windows Vista, will be upgraded automatically to .NET 4 unless enterprises explicitly turn that off. And then you will see future releases of Windows include .NET 4 built in. So I'm going to do some mobile questions here. A few people have asked around Silverlight support around with SQL CE4. Like I said, it's not mobile, that's a Silverlight channel. We are looking at SQL CE support for Silverlight, so that is something that we're looking at. Don't have anything to announce yet, but that is something we're looking at. A couple people asked about Windows Phone 7 coming out. Obviously, one of the big new releases coming out from Microsoft later this year is our Windows Phone 7. It's a pretty major update, reset of our whole phone strategy, and starting to get some really good reviews. The nice thing about Windows Phone 7 is the programming model is all .NET based. You use Silverlight for applications, and you use XNA for games. And there's a whole app store and rich set of development tools for targeting it. Silverlight is kind of the cornerstone of our development environment for that. And if you haven't checked it out, I have a couple of good blog posts on it. I think from March of this year, I have a good how to build a Twitter client using Silverlight and Windows Phone 7 and our phone development tools. That's pretty cool to check out. Probably the last questions about Silverlight showing up on Android and other devices. We don't have any announcements around that just yet. No, it is something that we continue to look at, but don't have any announcements there. People have likewise about iPad support. iPhone and iPad support is something that Apple controls, whether or not we can go there. And right now, they're not enthused about other runtimes running on their phone. But if they change their mind, it's something that we'll certainly look at. One of the things we have done, though, that's sort of related to Silverlight is with our Media Services 4 product, which is our server product that does media streaming to Silverlight clients. With the new version 4 release that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, it's in beta today. You can download in beta form today. The final release will be coming out in the not-too-distant future. It actually includes streaming support to the iPhone and iPad. And so you can basically encode video using the smooth streaming format that we've always supported with Silverlight, which gives you kind of a nice adaptive, really high-quality video. Now you can actually encode into smooth streaming, and we can actually do what's called transmuxing to automatically convert it into the iPhone format. And then you can actually have both an Objective-C-based iPhone, iPad app consume it, or we actually also support the video tag format that Safari on the iPhone, iPad support. And so you can actually stream media directly there without someone having to install anything. If you have an iPhone or iPad and want to check this out, load up your Safari browser inside your iPhone or iPad and go to www.iis.net as an information server.net. So www.is.net/iPhone, and you can see a cool example of Silverlight media content being streamed to the browser on an iPhone, iPad device with no custom client software installed, all being used with the IS Media Services 4 product on the back end. And that's a free product that runs on top of any Windows server. Question was, in the .NET 3.5 Plus world, are there still justifiable reasons to use stored procedures? There are lots of good controversial questions today. Stored procedures, I think, is kind of the third rail of blog posts. If you mention stored procedures, either they're good or bad, the hounds come after you, regardless of what you say. But I'm going to be bold and try to actually answer it here, which will probably offend at least half the people on the call. In terms of are there justifiable reasons to use stored procedures, the answer is yes. Stored procedures are not bad, nor are they good. I mean, they're a technique, and there's good reasons to use the technique, and there's bad reasons to use the technique. And even in the .NET 3.5 Plus world, where we have object relational mappers, whether it's linked to SQL, whether it's Entity Framework, whether it's Hibernate or others, there are still reasons to use stored procedures. The main two reasons that I think even object relational mapper advocates would probably argue is a valid reason to use stored procedures. One is if you are, for security reasons, want to kind of really lock down access to the database. Stored procedures do provide a way that you can disable, for example, the ability to execute raw SQL against the database, and instead tightly control access only through specific stored procedures. And so for certain environments, let's say a healthcare environment, there might be reasons why you can't grant anyone remotely access to all the data, and stored procedures providing one mechanism to lock that down. There's other ways to do it as well with views and things like that, but stored procedures are one approach for both requesting and updating data. I think the other reason for some stored procedures is that you can take advantage of what was I going to say? Sorry. Is that for certain types of queries, sometimes there's select reasons why, if you want to, for example, do something that can't be easily expressed through an object relational mapper, there's occasionally sometimes when stored procedures, because they're a little closer to the database engine, give you some extra capabilities in terms of that. So there are good reasons, I think, still to use stored procedures. At the same time, personally, I'm a big fan of object relational mappers, and so I kind of use the model of if you can do it with an object relational mapper, I'd recommend doing so, and mainly because of the productivity benefits they can give you now, and I think also some of the ability they give you for slightly cleaner testing and easier testing support and easier deployment support. And in general, I'd say if you look at, say, some of the EF4 Code First tutorials I've written over the last couple of weeks, and think about it combined with things like SQL, CE for kind of rapid development, and then upsizing it to SQL Server or SQL Azure. I think it's a pretty sweet way to do development, and I think from a productivity and a architecture enterprise flexibility perspective, give you some nice benefits in terms of doing there. So I'm a big ORM fan myself. So I think I've managed to offend everyone on that answer. But generally, what I'd say with a lot of these things is be pragmatic, and there's never, with computer science in general, any black and white reason that you must do it a certain way. The most popular answer is usually it depends, and be thoughtful in terms of what you pick. Other questions. A couple of other Phone 7 questions. One was, any news on private enterprise application development and deployment for Windows Phone 7? For a lot of people, especially people doing enterprise development, have asked, like, hey, I like Windows Phone 7, it's great, .NET, it looks cool, it doesn't suck anymore. I want to be able to do enterprise development, though. How do I get an enterprise app on there? With Windows Phone 7, the initial release that's coming out later this fall, the App Store is kind of a global App Store, meaning if you want to install apps, you need to install it through the App Store, and the App Store is available to everyone. That's very good for consumer apps. A lot of people have asked, for enterprise, I don't want to put my enterprise line of business app up in the global App Store. I could, technically, but I don't really want to expose my customers or my company information up to the App Store. Technically, you're not actually exposing your data up to the App Store. It's just the app itself, but still, a lot of people just don't want to do that. We do plan to enable side loading of apps and the ability to have kind of private enterprise app stores for line of business applications in the future. Unfortunately, right now, for the initial release this fall, it'll be consumer only in the App Store. So it is just a global App Store, but you'll see more in the future. The main reason for that is simply time, and we focus with Windows Phone 7 on making sure that we have a great consumer story, mainly because one of the things we've learned with Windows Phone 6.5 and earlier is every enterprise user is also a consumer, and if they don't want to use the phone or they find the phone, they have an alternative preference as their main phone, they really don't want to use it. And so we really try to make sure that we can get a really great consumer experience with the Phone 7, and then we'll be adding even richer enterprise line of business and deployment scenarios shortly after that. Other questions on Phone 7? A couple people asked, why no list view or grid view control on Silverlight for Windows Phone 7? In terms of kind of why isn't there a grid view control, again, part of it was our focus has been a little bit more on consumer scenarios, and so data grid controls tend to be a little bit more, I'm just going to put you on mute for 1 second, so I'm about to sneeze. 1 second. Back again, sorry, just want to sneeze. Hundreds of people. But one of the reasons why we don't have a grid view control is partly because of the focus on kind of more consumer scenarios, and data grid scenarios tend to be more kind of a little bit more line of business. The other thing that we've tried to do with Windows Phone 7 has been to focus more on really polishing that touch user experience, and that's something where we haven't done the work yet on our grid view control to support kind of great touch gestures. And so there's a couple of Silverlight controls that are not supported on Windows Phone 7 explicitly for that reason, because we want to have a really polished multi-touch experience, and we feel like we need to go through a few of our controls and refine it before we do that. But you will definitely see more data editing controls in the future, as well as more consumer controls in the future as well. Someone asked a question, will Windows Phone 7 add kind of an ad network support similar to iAds? If people don't know, iAds is the ad network support on the iPhone, iPad that Apple's rolling out. I think you will see network ad support similar to iAds in the future. We don't have a closed ecosystem, so or not as closed as say others. So you will actually, I think you'll see ad networks, including Google and others, probably roll out their mobile ad networks on Windows Phone 7 in the future as well. And then I think you'll probably see us have a mobile ad network as well that we support as a developer. So you can use any mobile ad network on Windows Phone 7, I believe, and I expect to see a lot more there in the future. A couple other questions, mobile related. What about VB language support for Windows Phone 7? Any chance of that showing up? Definitely VB support for Windows Phone 7 will be showing up. That's a really difficult cut that we made and did not make very voluntarily. Basically, the reason we don't currently have VB support is there's a few OS things that we needed around to support the VB language runtime. The VB language itself works, but it's the MS, what's called Microsoft Visual Basic.dll. There's a couple of language runtime features that we didn't support and didn't have time to support. That will be showing up in the near future, though, or certainly with the next refresh of Windows Phone 7. As we've already announced, VB support is definitely coming with the next refresh of Windows Phone. And that is something that we think is important. Someone else asked the question, do we ever see VB.NET phasing out in favor of C#? Definitely don't see that happening. VB is definitely something we're fully supported and committed around, and pretty much all of our new language features as we look ahead to .NET 5 and the next version of Visual Studio, all the language features we introduce will show up both in C# and in VB, and that's something we're pretty committed to from a language evolution perspective. Someone asked, will VB ever be freed from the Microsoft Visual Basic assembly? It is actually something we're looking at. One idea we have is, can the compiler actually generate the code that's currently required with the Microsoft Visual Basic assembly? And so it's just a compile time step as opposed to a runtime library. That's something we're looking at. Hopefully that's something we'll be able to implement in the sometime in the future. But we don't have that implemented just yet. Let's see. Just going to go back to some old questions, see what I've missed here. One last phone one I was mentioned. Well, what about Silverlight in-browser for Windows Phone 7 devices? When will it be fully supported? Silverlight is definitely supported on Windows Phone 7 for building apps. We don't currently support it in the browser. And the main reason for that is mostly around, for mobile scenarios, we actually think, and frankly, Apple and the iPhone kind of shown this a little bit. One of the primary use cases that people really seem interested in, and so sort of what we focus Silverlight on for Windows Phone 7 is kind of the apps story, meaning rather than always pop open a browser and navigate somewhere, instead you want to quickly click on an app, launch it real quick, do something with it, close it real quick. And so that's kind of what we focused a lot on with Windows Phone 7. And so right now we don't yet support Silverlight running in the browser as a control just yet on Windows Phone. Few people asked me again recently about link to SQL and EF. Just want to again kind of reiterate both are fully supported going forward. I answered the question at the beginning of the call, so I'm not going to go into the same long answer. But lots of improvements have been made with both with link to SQL with .NET 4 and especially with EF with .NET 4. And both are fully supported going forward. Someone asked a question about the stronger tool set for WPF in VS 2010. What do you think the future is for WinForms apps compared to WPF apps? Which way should a developer lean in the corporate sector? It's a good question. I mean, one of the things that's kind of tricky about that, the answer is WPF is now much more powerful than Windows Forms. So if you're someone who knows WPF in the corporate sector and you're building an application, in general, I'd say WPF and Silverlight give you a lot more power than Windows Forms. And unlike previous releases, we now have the tooling set and the runtime feature set where I think it's now a super set of Windows Forms. So if your team knows it, I definitely would recommend using WPF or Silverlight for line of business applications. The one, I'd say, downside with WPF and Silverlight over Windows Forms is there is a little bit more of a learning curve. There's a little bit more concepts in WPF and Silverlight. Those concepts are very powerful. So things like data binding and XAML and layout containers are, super powerful and super useful. But, if you're trying to build a simple forms over data application, that is a space where, WinForms, partly because it doesn't have all that power, can sometimes be a tiny bit simpler to implement. But I think the designer support for both WPF and Silverlight within Visual Studio 2010 does actually help tremendously in equalizing that. And if you can, I would recommend using WPF or Silverlight to start off with for client development. Let's see. Someone asked about project templates for design patterns in Visual Studio like NetBeans has. I definitely recommend checking out the Patterns and Practices group. They provide a bunch of free project templates, including Prism, which for client applications helps a lot in terms of patterns and better unit testing support. And so if you're looking for something like that, definitely check out the Patterns and Practices at Microsoft, and those integrate nicely with both .NET, Silverlight, and Visual Studio. Let's see. Is WPF a fit for custom ERP system development? Yeah, I think it is. There's a lot of big ERP vendors and big enterprise ISVs that use WPF and have been very successful with it. So I definitely do think WPF is a good role there. Just quickly skimming down here. So many people asked about. Where I missed it. Patterns with we have a model view controller pattern, which is very web-centric. What about model view tools and models for non-web apps? We actually do have a pattern. So we have model view controller. So ASP.NET is a model view controller patterns-based approach for server-based development. We also have a pattern we call model view model, or MVVM, which is it's kind of a logical analogy to model view controller for the client, and that's supported with both Silverlight and WPF. Today, MVVM is more of a pattern or best practice as opposed to kind of a product, and there's multiple different ways you can implement model view model. If you search the web, you can probably find at least 12 different ways to implement MVVM. I'm pushing my team to kind of come up with kind of a more prescriptive approach for MVVM, including Visual Studio tooling support in the future. So that is something I would like us to see get a little bit more prescriptive about. We'll still support lots of different MVVM approaches, but I'd love to have a little bit more tooling support to kind of guide people towards. So that is something we're looking at in the future. Someone asked a question about I-Notify property change. Is there a way to do it with WPF and Silverlight, which requires less code and less magic strings? That's also something definitely I've harped on my team about. It's definitely relatively straightforward today. It's just very verbose. That is something that we're looking to try to make support a little bit easier or a little bit cleaner in the future. A couple people have asked, what's Microsoft doing to try to get people to upgrade from IE6 to IE9 and try to get IE6 lower on the web? I don't run the IE team, so I can't speak specifically for IE. I will say we are trying everything we can to try to get people off of IE6. I think we've done commercials, we've done programs, we've done campaigns. It is going down, and we're trying awfully hard. It is unfortunately hard sometimes to get people to upgrade. And we're as frustrated by that as probably you are. What about TFS? Some people asked about TFS. There's a bunch of improvements that have come out with TFS 2010. At some point, my .NET 4 series, I'm going to try to blog about it. But a ton of improvements with TFS 2010. We now support SQL Express, so you no longer need to have SQL Server proper. We no longer require SharePoint, although we still use SharePoint for the portal management, but you can now install TFS 2010 without needing SharePoint. You can actually install TFS 2010 on a vanilla clean machine now in less than 20 minutes. General performance and management of TFS is a lot easier. So if you haven't checked out TFS 2010, definitely recommend checking it out. It's now included built into MSDN subscriptions as well, so it doesn't cost anything extra if you have an MSDN subscription to buy. Someone asked a question about, can we add a filter search for Visual Studio add reference? Good news is I actually already have a feature for that for you. If you check my blog for the last couple of weeks, I have blogged and talked about the Microsoft Power productivity tool, or Visual Studio 2010 productivity power tools or extensions or something like that. Anyway, if you go to my blog, it's one of the last 10 blog posts. Install it. There is a extension that replaces the add reference dialog that's built into VS 2010. A, it's a lot faster, and B, it also supports filtering and searching. So that's now available literally today.
Hey Scott, quick question. Have you blogged about all the little features that are in that productivity pack?
I've done about 3 blog posts about it. So I blogged about a lot of the features. I haven't blogged about all of them. But I think I have blogged the add reference one like in June.
Cool. So for folks who are interested in that, I'll also be blogging about it on my blog probably later on in the year sometime. So I'll do an exhaustive treatment of that as well.
Couple last questions. So someone asked about, will we release a free TFS Express edition? Again, if you have Visual Studio and MSDN subscription, it's now quote-unquote free. It is a question about, do we have an Express edition for the Express products? We haven't announced anything there, but it's good feedback. We'll definitely, it's something we always evaluate. Last question I'll probably be able to do here, because we're out of time, is how is the relationship between Silverlight and Moonlight progressing? In general, pretty well. We work very closely with Miguel and his team at Novell, and my team actually delivers test cases to them, as well as we actually ship the codecs that Moonlight uses, and they actually distribute them as part of Moonlight. So, so in general, I'd say, we have a fairly close relationship. Miguel's team's great. Definitely really like the work that Moonlight's doing, and they're making great progress, and we're really excited to see the progress that they're making. So I apologize if I missed names. I apologize if I missed names. I think I got them all, but if not, always feel free to send me an email, and keep an eye on my blog and Twitter account. And I think for people that joined late, the transfer